Thank you for attending one of the All Institute's webinars. We have Nikki Eatchel of Scantron and Marten Roorda, who we're going to talk about what works and what doesn't work in terms of K-12 educational testing that can be used in professional assessment, certification, licensure programs. This is a Q&A session where I'll be asking these two esteemed individuals their certain questions throughout this webinar, and they'll have responses. So hopefully they'll have responses. And my name is Manny Straehle, and let's go to the next slide here. So just before we begin, just a quick introduction on the All Institute. It's part of AIR, which is the organization that I founded and lead. And this is the Applied Lifelong Learning Institute. We have essentially 5 goals for it. One, that it's engaging. One, that it's meaningful. One, that you could use the information and practice it and apply it. And then problem-based. If there's a problem that we use, such as the examples in the Q&A format that we might bring up, hopefully you can use it. So that's one of the goals when we think about learning at the All Institute. I'm going to have my colleagues introduce each other before we go into the questions. So why don't we start with Nikki Eatchel of Scantron. If you can introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you, Manny, for having me. And first of all, just let me say I appreciate being included in the session, particularly with Marten, who I think exceptionally highly of. So just being on the session together for me is definitely a positive. My name is Nikki Eatchel. I'm the Chief Assessment Officer for Scantron. I've been in the assessment industry about 24 years and have had the pleasure of working actually substantially both in the K-12 market as well as in professional assessment programs such as certification, licensure, and pre-employment. So this is actually a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So thank you for having me.
Okay, Marten.
Yeah, I'm Marten Roorda, the CEO of ACT. Thank you, Manny, for having me on this webinar. And I'm pleased to share some of my ideas with the audience. I've been in the industry, in the testing industry for a while. Before joining ACT, about 3.5 years ago, I worked at a testing company based in the Netherlands for 13 years. I have had more experience in educational technology even before joining the testing industry. I worked at Reed Elsevier, being responsible for e-learning solutions. At ACT, I've been transforming the company from a more traditional testing company into an assessment and learning company where we integrate solutions to offer better navigation to students and learners.
Okay. Thank you, both of you, for those introductions. And we're going to begin the webinar. The webinar is actually open to questions to folks on the webinar. We're also going to record this, so if you have questions later on, you could always send them to me, and I'll see if I can get them to Nikki or Marten if there's further questions and if they have time to respond. So let's move on to the next slide here. We're going to start the Q&A format here. All the questions will be on the slides, and then we're going to have Nikki and Marten answer them. So the first question is, there's always trends going on in our field of testing and assessment. Automatic item generation, gamification, remote proctoring, AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Those are really trending these days. So thinking of those trends that are occurring in the testing industry, which of these trends do you believe are used in K-12, and which of those do you think can be useful in professional testing on the certification licensure side of things? So why don't we begin with Marten, and then we'll have Nikki also respond after Marten does.
Okay, thank you. Some of the trends we're seeing in K-12 testing can also be are also being applied to professional testing and certification. Some of them are more applicable to professional testing. One thing, for instance, is remote proctoring or online proctoring is because if you look at the stakes of testing, so how high are the stakes? Well, a lot of the professional testing, the stakes are not as high as, for instance, if you look at the ACT when admissions or admission to college is at stake. So remote proctoring, where you can serve more of what you could call the mid stakes, is of better use. And it's sometimes even, as we see in some of our own products, you can even use human-less proctoring, so machine proctoring. One other trend I think that is very useful for professional testing is what they call AIG, automated item generation. It's less challenging than, for instance, educational testing, where one of the biggest challenges is to produce passages. It's not very easy. We're working on that, but it's still difficult. We're already offering AIG, automated item generation, for professional testing. We have our first customers in certification, where we offer 100% automated item generation. Some other trends are like Manny, you mentioned earlier, gamification is maybe a bit more difficult for professional testing because of the price of development that comes along with it. It's quite expensive. So not all of the certification programs will be able to afford that. I can mention a few more, but I'd like to have Nikki now to answer the question as well.
Great. Thank you, Martin. I certainly agree and support with those trends Martin has noted. I think you could talk about any number of them, right? I think we're very fortunate at this point in time in the assessment industry, largely based on advances in other industries as well, to have a good number of trends going on. I think if I were going to pick a couple that I think have the most promise to make substantial impact into the professional testing as well, I think there's two I probably would focus on. The first one being really about the trend in K-12 to be looking really at a broader sense of what it means to assess a student, and the broader sense of what is really included in assessment data. I think for many years under No Child Left Behind, we had really what I would consider narrow data points being used to evaluate students, right? It was the end of year sort of summative assessments that kind of reigned all. And since we've had the shift under the Every Student Succeeds Act, it hasn't gone as quickly as I would have liked, but we are seeing a shift away from sort of that really narrow set of data points to a much broader set, of data points, both in the assessment area and others. So from an assessment standpoint, even in the core subjects, it's not just about those end of year scores anymore. Those are certainly valuable data points, but it's also looking at how formative assessments are used throughout the year and periodic assessments. It's about growth over time, right? So not just how are you performing at one point in time, but how have you grown over the course of the year. There's expansion of different types of assessments outside of core assessments. ACT's got great, socio-emotional learning assessments now that are really looking at a broader set of what it means to be a successful student and certainly a successful person in life. We've got educational assessments now. Scantron's highly involved in, educational surveys, so climate surveys, safety surveys, surveys to parents and teachers and students. And really what all of this does is create a much broader and more holistic view of how a student is performing how a school is performing, how an educational system is performing, and therefore provide much better information about what support students might need, or what support, you know, educators or administrators might need. And so I think that's a really phenomenal trend. And where I think I'd love to see that expand more into the professional testing is, even though certainly certification organizations and licensure boards and employers certainly look at more than one piece of data, I certainly think there's still room to grow there in considering a much broader set of data points, right? Not just your knowledge of the industry, but some of those soft skills. Also looking at broader sets of data that really better reflect, right, a candidate's ability, whether in order to get a certification or license or to be hired. So I think that trend, should we be able to overflow that well into the professional testing environment, can really create, you know, a better and sort of with more integrity evaluation of those potential candidates. I also think what goes right quickly with that is analytics, right? So in K-12, we've got great analytics systems going on. I know Scantron has one, as do other vendors. And the point of that process is to bring in all those new and great and different data points into an environment where the right information can get to the right stakeholders in a very consumable and a very actionable way. And I think K-12 is actually far ahead of that than, say, a professional testing environment. There's certainly analytics being used in business, but they're not really being applied well to write candidates for licensure or ongoing evaluation of lifelong learners in their profession. So I'd love to see that better implemented in a professional testing environment in order to provide better ongoing, you know, sort of training and engagement for employees and for certificates or individuals practicing in certain professions, to ensure we keep them engaged, to help ensure they do all that great ongoing learning to really practice their profession really well, not just at the beginning of their career, but really throughout their entire career. So those are two of the things that I think are super exciting in the K-12 industry and have really great applicability, you know, on the professional testing side.
Thank you both for those great responses. I was just wondering, there's all these trends that could be transferred to through professional testing, and it doesn't matter who responds first. I was just wondering, what do you think are the one or two barriers or obstacles of why we haven't adopted this in professional testing, licensure, certification world?
Well, maybe I should build on that second point of Nikki's, where she talked about the analytics, and that also refers to her first item, I think, with the monitoring the growth, like we're used to do in the K-12, is where you know, we can do a lot more in professional testing with that. So if we would have those analytics, like the learning analytics we do in K-12, we can do much better diagnostics and recommendations. We would also be able to provide workers with dynamic learning content, all kinds of educational resources, and create more individual pathways to get to certain goals or objectives. I think there's some limitation in professional testing that has to do with the lack of interest in some cases in predictive validity. It's almost like, you know, you have to check the box, you get your license, and then it's done. And then there's no interest in what happens next. And also the amount that both organizations and individuals are prepared to pay for the program has its limitations. So this is where sometimes in education there's more scale, and so the investment can get a better return maybe. But I think those are a few of the limitations in professional testing that prevent them from adopting those kind of practices.
Yeah, I would agree completely with Martin's points, and I think they kind of point to what I think is in general a difficult issue within the professional testing, which does impede some of these trends and things we want to be doing. And it's really around the culture of assessment, right? The culture of assessment, which has often been difficult in the K-12 environment, and I think has been shifting in the last number of years when all this pressure on the summative testing has come off to some degree. You know, the culture of assessment has been a really negative one, right? Which is, oh, you do assessments, you know, and that information is used in a negative way. That's often the perception of the candidates, though that's certainly never the intention of assessment providers or individuals who own assessments and are attempting to build really great and strong assessments to provide good feedback and to give people opportunities. The unfortunate culture of assessment in the general population tends to be negative. And it's been shifting in the K-12 side as really all this great data has been coming in to really assist parents and students and teachers to have the information they need throughout the year. We're seeing some good shifts there, I think. We still have a long way to go, but I think we're seeing that good shift in K-12. I don't think we've begun to see that shift in the professional testing environment, which I think is really interesting because we live in a data-hungry world, right? Like everybody's got the computer they're holding in their hand or the one on their wrist, and they love getting constant data about healthcare data or fitness data or weather data or news data. That everybody's craving and is looking at constantly. But when you suggest that you could also, to Martin's point, provide lifelong learning analytics and data to people to really allow them to be their best selves and to seek sort of those additional training opportunities or to focus in those areas where they're either already strong or could get better, people don't embrace that the same way as they embrace all the other data that they're bombarded with. So I think we've got to work much harder in the assessment industry to try to shift and change that culture of assessment. I think it's what also feeds into Martin's point about lack of interest in predictive validity, right? When you don't have a positive view of the data that's coming in, wanting to be able to use that data to predict how you or someone else might do in the future, and therefore where they might need assistance to stay on track or to really reach their full potential, you just don't even get to that point. And especially when you want people to invest, whether that be a company or even an individual person, in assessments or activities that are going to give them that data. Again, if the culture of assessment isn't a positive one, you're much less likely to want to be able to invest in those things, either as an organization or as an individual. So I think to me, that's one of our largest barriers, and really getting people to embrace that lifelong learning data and analytics is hugely beneficial. And something that can help you sort of get where you want to be, you know, much easier in life than if you don't embrace sort of this really great set of data that is potentially available to you.
Thank you both of you for your response to that question. While you were responding, one of the individuals on the chat box on our system had a question. And it was, how do you see the artificial intelligence predictors feeding into data analytics for students or professionals? And I don't know who wants to address that question.
Maybe I should have a go at that first, if I may. So that's it. In the way that we work with more dynamic learning content, as I mentioned before, is a way we can combine test questions with learning resources of any kind, whether it's open education resources or more premium type of resources. We can use machine learning algorithms to where we involve all the data that we have on an individual, to make the best recommendations for further learning. At ACT, we developed a recommendations and diagnostics engine that is doing that in real time. So you can experience that where you go to ACT Academy, the free practice platform for students, where that recommendations and diagnostics engine is already running using artificial intelligence. So it will find the right resource for you depending on the questions that you answer. But of course, the AI can also be used on different levels, not so much in real time, but making the kind of recommendations that are, for instance, in creating a learning pathway longer term, or help you find the right college or major. Those kind of decisions can be supported with AI technologies as well.
And if
Great.
I could add on to that, oh, sorry, Manny.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nikki, you have anything to add? Go ahead.
And I actually think both with sort of AI predictors, but also just general predictive analytics overall, whether or not that's AI predictors or whether you've got predictive validity studies that really drive and build into analytics programs. I think that regardless of whether or not they're AI or that's a component or it's the whole thing, that predictive analytics, I think, has huge potentially positive impacts on both students and professionals should we get the opportunity, right, to best utilize those. Already in the K-12 environment, we have great success on the analytics side.
Great. Thank you for your response. We're going to move forward and go on to the next question. The next question, I think some of it was already answered implicitly, but we're going to make this more explicit. Do you think any of the trends are meeting the needs that are out there in terms of the professional certification and assessment industries? And maybe if you could tell us more of how you think that is. And you can pick one or two trends, or you can focus on more than one. But so why don't we begin with Nikki, because we began with Martin the last time.
And then, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm clear. Do I think they're meeting the trends are meeting the needs in the K-12 industry, or do I think there's trends that came out of K-12 that are meeting the needs in the professional industry? I wasn't exactly sure.
Yeah, it's the latter. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's the latter.
Oh, no problem. I think I would say, at least in a couple that I'm predominantly focused on, I'd say it's a little early to tell. The couple that we've talked about so far, I think are the ones that are more emerging on the professional testing side, the more holistic sort of views and evaluations of candidates, the use of analytics, for sort of more lifelong learning approach for employees and candidates, I think is more emerging. I think where you look at other trends maybe we haven't focused on as much, like AI and gaming and performance-based assessments, which certainly are more emerging on the K-12 side. I think those trends on the K-12 side are certainly infiltrating professional testing, or have for some time, and are certainly meeting the needs of those particular markets in getting better assessment and different types of skills assessments for their candidates, for their particular profession. But I do think in some of those areas of those trends that we've seen on the K-12 side, they're really just emerging.
That comes along with it. There's oftentimes a mismatch between the promise and what it's really capable of. Of course, when you're a new company and offering an exciting new technology, you would like to make a good promise of what it can do, and focus less on what it can't do. But this is a bit of a problem sometimes. So I'd like for all those new technology tools and engines to at least be research based, but also be efficacy based. So if you so that you know what the effect of the technology is, but also to be very transparent. There's a lot of black boxes. You just don't know what happens inside of that. So and the other thing I think that is a bit of a mismatch. It has to do with accessibility and affordability. So especially the new technologies will require more expensive rates, but also if it's computer based, it will require a good broadband access to internet. So it's about that type of accessibility and digital divide, but also in terms of pricing, should still be affordable. So for instance, if you want to create a very nice virtual reality or augmented reality game to assess people's skills, of course that's very attractive. But the question is that affordable, both on the sponsor side, but also on the consumer side. So those kind of issues will certainly need to be addressed in the future.
Okay, Nikki.
Yeah, I think there's always, and I think it was a very elegant point about promises versus delivery. And I think there's always a lot of enthusiasm, especially in the state of rapid change that we're in from a technology perspective. I do think there's always a lot of enthusiasm about new types of assessments, new ways of delivery, and just different technological advancements that can be helpful in assessment. And I certainly am excited about all those things too. But I think I don't know if it's a mismatch, but I think where I feel like we maybe a component missing versus a mismatch is as we head down and we sort of get excited about these various trends. One of the things where I think we miss from an assessment standpoint is both on the K-12 side and the professional testing side is making assumptions that the end users and the stakeholders that absorb these new technologies and these new assessments or utilizing them, that they really have the best understanding of not only how to utilize that specific assessment or that new specific technology enhancement, for example, within an assessment, but how it appropriately fits in to their overall assessment program. And for as long as I've been in the assessment industry, I rarely see a district, a state, or even professional organizations that are utilizing assessments ever put out like tenders or requests for services that are specifically around providing professional development and training to their key stakeholders about the best way to implement their overall assessment program. Certainly we all give training for our specific assessments and our specific products about how you use the product, how you use the assessment, certainly how you should be interpreting and not interpreting the assessment. But those are specific and individual to that one given assessment. What's rarely done is, well, how does that one assessment fit in with all the other assessments that a state or a district are giving? How does that one assessment fit in or not fit in or overlap with other assessments that an employer is already giving? And how do they utilize all of those components and all of their various assessment data in the fairest and the best and the most appropriate way for their students, for their candidates? I think that rarely occurs, that kind of training. And I think we in the assessment industry, I think, have a responsibility to try to get those sorts of services and provide those sorts of assistance and consultation where we can, or to potentially even integrate that into some of the other services that we provide, since clearly it's not something people think about utilizing independently. So I think that's a miss for us in the trends right now. And I think to Martin's point as well about the promises versus the reality, I think while every assessment industry person, all of those of us that work in assessment are always constantly worried about fairness and data integrity and accessibility for the largest set and broadest set of students or candidates. I do think as we get caught up in trends, it's really critical to remember that we have to be under constant vigilance and constant evaluation about how those assessments, how those new technologies, how those new advancements that we're implementing, how they do impact, subgroup populations, whether that be as students or candidates. That we should constantly be looking at, the differential functioning of items or assessments across these different subgroups, of our sensitivity and bias and fairness for all of those groups, the usability, to Martin's point, and availability to each of those subgroups as well. And while I certainly think everybody has that in mind, I think we can get caught up in the promise, and people particularly who are focused on the technology versus truly the assessment can sometimes lose a little bit of that focus on fairness and accessibility to all of the student population and all of the candidate population, which really should always be at the forefront, of our concern.
I think there's a lot that you both have mentioned there, and that can require, a lot of follow-up, and create about 17 more webinars. Many more webinars than 17. I don't know why that came out of my mouth. 17, it probably has to do with the Beatles or something like that. But I think one of the things that's key is that often when we go to these industry conferences that talk about assessment trends and these solutions that are out there, I do find that strategic piece or the essential purpose of the assessment, which is to measure something. Is missed in the fundamentals of things a lot of the times, where you talk about fairness, validity, reliability, those really pillars of the world. When I go into different industries, they still hold on to those things like it's dear life. Like in security, you're talking about confidentiality, integrity of the data consistently. They're holding on to those sort of pillars that they hold on to. And I think when we talk about trends and particularly the trends, I think we miss that point. So I think that's really great that you all brought that into it. One of the other sort of things I wanted to follow up on was, this piece on promise and reality. And I was just wondering for the audience, given both of your experiences, is there a group that you think that really did, and it's not more of a, and it could be outside of our own field, which might be I think ethical in some ways, so you're not product endorsing that has met that as an example. So somebody who goes out there and says, I had this really awesome gamification or performance-based assessment platform, and it's definitely going to meet the needs. It's going to do all these great things, and they actually promise, on meeting that need and for all the stakeholders involved. Do you have any good examples? It could be many years ago, or it could be something outside of this field as well, just so that the audience might have something to hold on to. If that question makes sense either way.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think from my, Martin, if you want to take
you go first.
In being sensitive to not endorsing certainly either myself, my organization, or any other particular organization, because I think I'm a very glass half full kind of person who assumes everybody working in our industry is really trying to deliver on their promise. So I think what I would say about that is I think people have a difficult time, and I think that this is regardless of the industry that you work in or the kind of product that you're providing. The promises that we make about those things are usually multifaceted, and sometimes the nuances to those promises can largely be misunderstood even when you first launch, especially in the age where we've got technology reigning, right? So there's been a lot of technology companies that have come into the assessment industry, software, companies that don't necessarily have an assessment background, but who are really great at creating software and sort of games and things like that, which fill the promise of certain components of it, like engagement and really interactive UI and other things like that, and really do have value, right, to what they're providing. But I think that the piece that while that gets to be really attractive and fun for people to utilize, the nuances to that of understanding, and I think Martin made this point, the research base behind that and the efficacy of those measurements really to be as helpful as possible to all components of the student population or the candidate population, that's a very nuanced approach that sometimes takes the amount of time and research and development that is often counterintuitive to our more faster, world that we live in these days. So I think I'm probably answering the question in the exact opposite way, which is I think it's really hard to deliver on all of the nuances in an assessment industry around the promises that we make, so that it's a constant diligence by everybody. And what I would say is I caution anybody, if they're using any products or services, mine or anybody else's, to really dig into the underlying sort of foundation and research and proof of data, right, of what those products are promising, because I think it's hard to know for sure if you're getting what you need out of that product, if you're getting what you need out of that assessment, if your evaluation is very on the surface, because those promises are big and those promises are nuanced. So I think lots of companies are meeting their promises, but I think the ones that really do that very well, often people don't realize it because people kind of stop their evaluation at that surface level. So I would say there's lots of companies, I think, certainly Scantron and ACT included, that are meeting those promises. I think I'd really love people to sort of take the time to be diligent in any assessment product that they're using to confirm, right, that those promises are being made. So there's my somewhat answer to your question.
Yeah. My question was a somewhat question too. So, Martin, do you have a somewhat response?
I try to somewhat do that, but it's interesting. So some companies in the industry are pushing the envelope a bit, but I think a bit of the, and I'll get back to that, but I think a bit of the problem, especially if you look at the United States, is there is a quite traditional system of certification and licensure. It's state-based in many cases. It's very difficult to change that system from within or from the outside. So for instance, if you look at education, there's much more forces on the system. It can be from the legislator through new legislation, for instance, ESSA provides some opportunity to change. But also there's what I would call consumer power. People, if they don't like it, they step out or opt out. And that is something we have to look at and take into account. That's very different in, for instance, in a licensure system. You can say you opt out, but then you don't get a job. So that's very difficult to change that. So now we get back to that earlier point. So you see some of the more transformational change coming from outside the United States, not only in Europe, of course, but especially in Asia, and some companies there, for instance, in India, really offering some very nice innovative platforms for the workforce. One company I can mention is Aspiring Minds out of India. It's doing quite a nice job with the MCAT platform, very innovative, and they do that with very limited resources, and so I think they're setting a nice example, and also getting the inroads in the U.S. market.
Great, thank you for that. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have, I believe, 5 remaining questions. So I want to sort of ask my panelists, of the questions that are remaining, which of these do you want to respond to? And I'll go through them real quickly on this. This is question 4, applications. So, and then this is question 5, the product development side, things that can be applied to professional testing. Then there's a list of product development considerations that you may want to consider for professional testing. And then there's privacy and security. And then there's anything else you'd like to add that we didn't ask. So of these remaining questions, which one do we want to dive into?
I like question 4. But I'm very order-oriented. You're talking to assessment people, so going in order of questions presented is always attractive to obsessive compulsive personalities.
Okay. Okay, we'll do question 4 then. So what do you think should be applied in professional testing that is already applied in K-12 testing?
I think from my perspective, kind of to tie into some of the themes that we've talked about, some of it is already sort of being evaluated and incorporated in professional testing. That's the soft skills testing that we've certainly talked about, that is becoming more prominent in K-12. But the 2 of the things that I think are becoming pretty foundational on the K-12 side that I would like to see really get more traction on the professional testing side are things like the environmental surveys. So as we talked about in the educational sector, there's great momentum, and we do a lot of surveys now around climate, engagement, safety of the various stakeholder groups, your teachers, your students, your parents, your administrators. And I find it fascinating that we certainly have come to realize and have the research to support that information and that data around environment is really critical to understand because of its substantial impact on a student's ability to learn, on the environment and that the teachers feel supported to work in, that there is such substantial impact, right, to the educational environment that we've grown to understand that and start to really incorporate that kind of data into our evaluations at the student level, teacher level, and beyond. I find it really fascinating that particularly in an employment setting, or even when you're thinking about like certification and licensure, that we don't do the same sort of environmental analyses in our employment settings or in our sort of industry settings the same way that we now do in K-12. Now, that's not to say we don't ever do employee surveys things like that of vast amounts of sort of stakeholder views. And if they are, I don't think they're incorporated in the same way into really improving environment and really driving towards actionable assistance for ongoing educational growth or lifelong learning for either the employee who's already hired or the individual who's working from a certification or licensure standpoint in a given industry. I think understanding environment, right, and whether that the certification group that you're in for your industry, or whether that's as an employee in a given employment environment, I think understanding and utilizing that data again as part of a holistic evaluation would certainly go, I think, a long way in improving, client retention and or employee retention and engagement and growth and innovation that you see in given employee environments. We all know now, right, that people don't stay at jobs as long as they used to And usually the view is that you get better experience, sort of better pay increases, better promotional opportunities if you're moving from one job to the other versus if you're staying in one place for substantial periods of time. I think you could see a shift in that if you are actually paying attention and really specifically looking at your environmental survey data. So to me, that's one place where I would really like to see some of that move into the professional testing area. I think the other area that kind of flows right into there is the concept of growth, right? So we're very concerned about growth on the K-12 side, right? Not just how are you doing today, but how are you growing over the course of your entire educational career, right? Kindergarten through graduation, through higher education. We don't at all focus ourselves on the growth of individuals who've achieved the certification or individuals who have been hired into a certain job or position. Yes, we give maybe performance reviews, or yes, we look at recertification on occasion, but we don't do the same sort of evaluation and engagement with the growth of our employees and the growth of our individuals and who have certain certifications or licensures, except for very limited points along the way. And again, I feel like should we change the assessment culture, which encourages those sorts of evaluations of ongoing growth, and also provides then assistance and additional learning opportunities and professional growth assistance based on those measures of growth, that you would not only see sort of better employee performance and better performance in certain industries, but I actually firmly believe that you would see better advancements in overall industries if we were doing those sorts of things as well, to really encourage sort of lifelong learning and to encourage ongoing sort of growth within your own industry. We all know industries change rapidly, and those individuals who are more further engaged with growth and ongoing learning certainly are those that are performing, in that higher end of their profession than others. So those are the couple of things that I think are really taking hold in K-12 and showing really great benefit that I would love to see better implemented in the professional testing environment.
Great. Martin?
Well, as to Nikki's point about being actionable and also focus on growth, I think professional testing can learn a lot from some of the trends that are emerging in educational measurement, where there's more of what you could call a mastery-based approach to learning. In the end, you will get to the same learning objectives, of course. We should all arrive there, but there are different ways to get there. So it's more personalized. It's a way to integrate the learning and the measurement, and do the learning in a more continuous way. Of course, it's easy in education because the student is in the classroom all the time. So that's something that cannot be copied by the workforce. But I think testing should be in like professional testing should be more in the workplace situation, more connected with learning, lifelong learning, but also be just in time to what you need. So now at this moment, professional testing is in most cases it's more of a one-off. So you meet the requirements, you get your license. Of course, sometimes you have to renew, but that's not the whole battery that you have to take. You should see an assessment as an opportunity to learn. So the assessment should inform the learning and create a sort of a feedback loop, so that you can create a kind of more continuous learning progression throughout your tenure as an employee. And both the employer and the employee can benefit from that. So maybe it would cost a bit more, but the return on that investment is probably bigger. So that's my point.
Yes, thank you both. One of the things that tends to be becoming more and more prominent is exactly what you're all talking about with lifelong learning, continuous learning, real-time assessments was more applied. And it's interesting because it's almost like we're going back to the German apprenticeship model or co-op models that were founded in this country many years ago, and it's very costly. So it's just always been interesting in my mind why we haven't really adopted that. If that's really where we all want to go, real-time learning and real-time assessment. And I know that's more of a political question, so I think I'm just making a political somewhat statement there. But I think I wanted to just emphasize that piece of it. What I do want to sort of move towards concluding this and saying thank you, but I want to give both of you an opportunity to sort of have any comments, questions, or reactions to this webinar. Unfortunately, I wish we had more time to really address more of the remaining questions and other sort of thoughts or ideas that you had as well. So if you want to add anything else, please do so now.
Well, let me start, and Nikki can have the last word. So yeah, you mentioned the political element, and I don't have the intent to become very political, but it's certainly something to look at. If some of the things you'd like to do require more government involvement, and that's especially on the federal level. That's not very popular here in the United States with everyone. So that is when you mentioned the German model, like with apprenticeship, but it will also apply to the common standards, which are very successful in Germany as well. So it would require the willingness of all the states to work together on a common purpose. And that's I think a bit difficult. So what is interesting about at least the educational system, not only in the US of course, but also in other countries, is because this is about our kids and about our future. There's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of accountability in the system. Of course, we sometimes complain about that, but it's certainly useful to keep the system healthy and to address questions like are we doing the right investments and so on. And that's much more difficult if you look at the workforce or in professional testing. So that is another thing that we can learn from K-12. So to help to hold the system accountable for the choices that are being made and the political decisions and the actions by policymakers on all kinds of levels.
And I think if I was gonna put, yep, there I am jumping the gun again. I think I first of all, thank you again for having me in this conversation. Just being able to hear other people's thoughts, certainly like wonderful people like Martin and yours as well, Manny, I think are always just helpful to me in the industry in general. I think just to close out the theme again of K-12 and what is applicable in professional testing, and kind of to link on to what Martin just said, I think that as somebody who has only really in my truly professional adult life ever worked in the assessment industry and can't imagine working anywhere else, what I love about this industry is its capability to support growth and opportunity. And I think that is a huge responsibility. It's a huge privilege to work in this industry, but it's also a huge responsibility as well. Every assessment that we create, whether it's low stakes, mid stakes, or high stakes, certainly has implication for the individuals taking it, for other stakeholder groups, and for the public at large. So we have a huge responsibility to ensure validity, reliability, fairness, accessibility, right? All of those things are absolutely critical, and we don't get a buy on that because of, you know, the massive sort of time frame that we're in for technological advancement and change, right? We're seeing so much more of that in the last 10 years than we have in the last 100 years. And, you know, the assessment industry has a critical responsibility to be ensuring that we're paying attention to all of those sort of underlying tenets of our industry. And I do think in the K-12 industry, it's a little bit different than the professional testing. I did employment litigation support for years at the beginning of my career, and so I'm definitely steeped in professional testing and legal liability there and fairness there. But when you are in a K-12 industry in which you're talking about children, you know, not adults taking your assessments, but individuals who, but students who don't have the same capability, right, to let you know if they don't think, you know, an assessment is appropriate or fair, or to give you the kind of feedback that you tend to get from adults. I think because of that population that we work with in K-12, and because of the additional regulations and evaluation that you do get in K-12 from state government and federal government, I do think it drives I think a different level of focus than you get in the professional testing industry. And that's not to imply, I know I work in the professional testing industry, and every organization I've ever worked with in that industry is highly conscious of fairness and validity and accessibility. But again, it just has a different flavor to it in K-12 because of the population that you're dealing with. So I think as all these advancements continue to roll out and all these trends continue to be at top of mind for our consumers of the assessments, it's even more important that both sides, K-12 and professional testing, keep those foundational tenets in mind, because it is our biggest responsibility and our greatest privilege to make sure that what we're doing is helping, right, society get the information that they need for education and growth and public protection and all of those things. And if we ever lose sight of that due to technological enhancements, then we're failing on an ethic level. So that's just, you know, one of the things I always want to keep in mind is as the fun trends and advancements go on, our underlying responsibilities stay the same. And just I encourage and appreciate working with everybody who continues to keep that in mind.
Well, thank you both for your closing statements and your participation here all for this and throughout. I wish there was more time, and maybe we'll do a part 2 to this at some point in the future. But thank you again. We are 3 minutes after the hour, and we will be recording this, and it'll be available shortly. So thank you again. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send it my way, and I could pass it on to our presenters, and we'll see from there. So thank you again on behalf of Assessment Education Research Experts. We are going to bid you farewell and thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
My pleasure.